By now, you have received your welcome email. There are a minimum of 7 attachments. They are all PDFs with the exception to one that's an Excel workbook. 3 of the PDFs are one-page checklists. For each checklist, there is a multiple-page detailed PDF that parallels it. The chart shown here shows how the documents relate to each other. The purpose of the checklists are for them to serve as a guide to be sure each item in the detailed documents are not overlooked. Therefore, checklists are a must-have for the project manager. For instance, there's a checklist called KW Project Completion Checklist-IT Department, and a document that's about 3 to 4 pages long called KW Preparation IT Department that provides details pertaining to each line item on the checklist. Another example is the KW Project Completion Checklist-Engineering that has a detailed document over a dozen pages long, again paralleling its checklist. As you can see in the chart, there is a possibility of 4 different detailed documents for this particular checklist. You will have only received one of these, which will be determined by your particular system's configuration. If this is a new build, then most likely your engineering/facilities department will not be installing the cabinets, but instead it will be the contractor. Therefore, make sure the contractor gets these applicable documents. Be warned, if you purchase multiple systems, you might have received different detailed documents for each system. If this is the case, then you cannot use the same directions for each. The email will provide more details on this. So, you'll need to forward the appropriate documents to the respective department heads. It's important to establish who the KeyWatcher admin will be early on so they can act as the overall project manager on each of the checklists. This way, they will also be familiar with the inner workings of the system. More importantly, this is actually the beginning of their administrator training for the KeyWatcher. And that brings us to this Excel workbook that consists of several spreadsheets. This workbook is used to collect and organize the information that will be entered into the KeyWatcher database. So as I'm sure you can understand, and as I mentioned earlier, it is imperative that the KeyWatcher administrator is intimately involved in setting up the database since they will be the one administrating it. Trying to bring someone in as the administrator weeks or months after it is in place would be counterproductive to us coming out for your setup and training. Completing the workbook is a long process that will require the workbook to be sent back and forth numerous times to us for proofing and tweaking, not something that can be accomplished in a few days to a week. One of your biggest challenges will most likely be to get all departments to cooperate with you by getting their employee lists of key sets, and who has access to what key sets. Assuming that you're new to the KeyWatcher, the easiest way to approach the workbook is to think of the system as being just like hiring a new employee to do key control. With a person in charge of issuing key sets, they would first need a list of key sets as well as a list of employees that could check the sets out. Then, assuming that not every employee could have access to any and all key sets, you would also create a list indicating which employee had access to which key sets. It's exactly the same with the KeyWatcher. The difference is that you're working with a computer rather than a person. First, notice all of the tabs at the bottom of the workbook. The good news is that, for the most part, you only need to be concerned with the Keys and Users tabs and the related instruction tabs. For the purposes of this video, the columns to focus on are the yellow highlighted ones. However, on your actual spreadsheets, they will be gray. Based on the information you enter in each of these, we should be able to do most of the rest for you. Once completed, we will import these lists into the database. Remember, Excel allows you to cut, copy, and paste. A database is far more rigid and therefore not as easy. The Intro tab is the first tab that is visible upon opening the workbook, so please review it first. This is a must-read. So let's start out with the key list. Each key set will be assigned a sequential ID number. This is the number the KeyWatcher will use to identify the key set. We encourage you to plan ahead and skip some numbers in an effort to leave room to grow and still have room to add keys next to other like key sets rather than at the bottom of the list. This should help you keep the system organized for a long time. On the other hand, putting off listing all the key sets to another day that you know will need to be secured is counterproductive and therefore should not be a consideration. How we decide to set the system up is dependent on the majority of the key sets being identified up front. The next column, Old Key Set ID, is self-explanatory and doesn't apply to new builds. Each key set will need a name, which typically is not a person's name. It should represent its usage. A common example would be the job title of the person who typically has access to it, or what the set is used for. If you purchased our colored, tamper-proof key rings, then each ring will be sealed with one of the 7 colored hubs. Colors can be used to color code like key sets, or use colors such as red and yellow to distinguish their importance. Enter each job title that needs access to each key set in the requester column. If multiple job titles need access to the same key set, then separate them with a comma. TZ stands for time zone. This controls how long a key set can be out before triggering an overdue key alarm. For instance, if the employees using a key set are on an 8-hour shift, then you would put 8 for 8 hours. If you purchase the dual triple user option, then you'll have these additional columns. Leave these 2 columns blank if it is a single user set. Put an X in either the dual or triple columns to signify the key set requires 2 or 3 users to sign it out. The second job title and third job title columns is where you would put the job titles of those users. See the Keys Instructions tab for details on these additional columns. Next, as you may have already figured out, is the user listing. While there are a lot of columns, initially you only need to be concerned with these few. More good news is that half the columns are self-explanatory. The first column is the user's department, such as security. To the far right is the title column, which stores the user's job title. An example for the title column entries would be security manager, security supervisor, and security officer. Always keep like departments and job titles together in the listing. Of course, there are the first and last name columns. If this is a new build and you don't have many of the names yet because they haven't been hired, then simply create blank records based on an approximate number of people that will be hired for each position using the department and title as placeholders. You can then fill in the names as they're hired. The access level controls what a user can and can't do at the cabinet. There are 5 different access levels. See the User Instructions tab for the legend. The max number of key sets controls how many sets a user can have in their possession at any given point in time. For instance, if I have access to a dozen different key sets, but you don't want me to have all of them out at the same time, then you can limit how many I can have by entering the maximum number. Entering the employee ID is optional, but we do encourage it. If your system includes a biometric hand reader, then this field is mandatory because the users will use their employee ID to log in. Please understand that a fingerprint reader is different than a hand reader, and therefore the employee ID would not be used to log in, so the employee ID would be optional. In closing, please don't assume that this workbook is something that can be thrown together in a few days, and therefore be prepared to submit it multiple times for review and modifications. Please maintain our file naming convention as detailed in the Excel Workbook's Introduction tab. Because we service many customers on a daily basis, proper naming will ensure that your data is accurately and safely handled and will minimize completion time. The most common problem we see is where the documents never make their way down to the actual people within each department that have been assigned the project. Therefore, please encourage the department heads to have the actual people that they've assigned to the project to contact us directly. Remember that we encourage you and your teams to call us as often as needed for help.